In the quiet suburbs of San Bernardino, California, Christine Perry's life seemed stable, even idyllic. A devoted wife and mother, she had built a home rooted in faith, family, and the unwavering support of her church. At the heart of this life was her husband, Phil Perry, a deacon, a spiritual leader, and a man many in their community looked up to. To the outside world, the Perry family embodied Christian devotion. But behind the closed doors of their home, Christine was witnessing the slow unraveling of everything she had built. Phil Perry had changed. The warm, attentive husband she once knew had become distant, his late nights growing longer, his explanations growing thinner. The tension in their home was palpable. Then came the whispers in the congregation, the knowing looks, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room. It wasn't long before Christine discovered the devastating truth. Phil was having an affair. The betrayal cut deep, made all the worse by the identity of the other woman, Lisa Bragg, a member of their very own church. The hypocrisy was staggering. A man who preached morality and faithfulness had been unfaithful himself. Confronted with the truth, Phil didn't deny it. Instead, he made it clear. He wanted out. He wanted a divorce. For Christine, it was like watching her world collapse in slow motion. Their marriage was over, but her devastation was far from complete. The morning after their final conversation, Phil walked out of their house. Christine watched him go, unaware that this would be the last time she would ever see him alive. Days later, Christine reported her husband missing. When the police asked if she knew where he was, she hesitated. No, she didn't always know his whereabouts, but she had never imagined he would disappear without a trace. It wasn't just the disappearance itself that troubled the authorities. It was the way Christine spoke about her husband, the way the weight of their broken marriage hung in the air. 3 days later, on a quiet street in Tijuana, Mexico, Detective Ellison made a grim discovery. Phil Perry's white Chrysler sat abandoned. The doors were locked and the air inside was thick with the stench of death. Slumped in the back seat was Phil Perry, his body motionless, his life stolen by a single gunshot wound to the back. He had been forced down, subdued, and then executed. The investigation quickly zeroed in on the most obvious suspects, Lisa Bragg and her husband, Carl. It was no secret that Carl had discovered his wife's affair with Phil. The letters they had exchanged were explicit, detailing intimate moments that Carl could no longer deny. The betrayal stung, not just because Lisa was unfaithful, but because Phil Perry had once been a trusted friend. Carl had confided in him and sought his guidance, and yet, behind his back, the deacon had taken his wife. It wasn't long before investigators uncovered a crucial clue, border records showing that Carl Bragg's Jeep had crossed into Mexico on the very day Phil Perry was reported missing. But Carl had an alibi. He insisted he had been at the hospital with his sick child that night, and witnesses confirmed his story. He had an ironclad defense. Still, something didn't sit right. If Carl didn't pull the trigger, did someone else do it for him? That's when detectives heard the story of a woman in the church parking lot. Witnesses recalled a short Hispanic woman asking for help with her car the night Phil Perry disappeared. She claimed to need jumper cables. Phil, always ready to assist, went to help her. That was the last time he was seen alive. For more than a decade, this lead went nowhere. No one knew who the woman was, and without more evidence, the case went cold. Years passed, and Phil Perry's murder remained a mystery, until, finally, the woman resurfaced. Her name was Liz Minor, and she wasn't just a stranger looking for help, she was Carl Bragg's stepsister. Under the weight of questioning, Liz crumbled. She admitted that she had been in the church parking lot that night, luring Phil Perry into a trap. But she wasn't acting alone. Scott Harrison, a close friend of Carl's, was there too. He was the one holding the gun. Liz described how she had approached Phil Perry, pretending to need help. And then, out of the darkness, Scott Harrison appeared. He silenced Phil with tape over his mouth and forced him into the car. She was terrified. Then a sudden gunshot rang out, deafening her. Scott Harrison had pulled the trigger. With Liz's confession, police finally had enough evidence to arrest Carl Bragg, who was now going by a new name, Carl DiTommaso. But Carl, ever the manipulator, refused to admit to ordering Phil's murder. He insisted that he had only wanted Scott to scare him. The prosecution didn't buy it. In 2001, the long-delayed case moved forward. Liz Minor, knowing there was no escape, took a plea deal. She pled guilty to manslaughter and kidnapping and was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Carl DiTommaso chose to fight. His trial painted him as the mastermind behind the crime, the man who set it all in motion. The evidence was clear. He had orchestrated the attack, lured Perry into a trap, and ensured his silence. The jury found him guilty of second-degree murder, sentencing him to 15 years to life. But there was one more trial. Scott Harrison, the alleged triggerman, was the last to stand before the court in 2005. His defense was simple. He claimed he wasn't involved. His attorneys attacked the credibility of Liz Minor and Carl DiTommaso, painting them as unreliable witnesses. It worked. The jury wasn't convinced, and Scott Harrison walked free. For Christine Perry, the years of uncertainty had finally ended. The man who destroyed her marriage had met a violent end, but the truth had finally come to light. Phil Perry's murder had been about revenge, about humiliation turned into rage. And while Carl DiTommaso sat behind bars, Scott Harrison lived his life as a free man. Justice had been served, at least, in part. For the Perry family, the wounds would never fully heal, but at least now they knew the truth. Phil Perry was a man of faith, a respected deacon, and a devoted spiritual leader. But beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect life lay a secret affair that would cost him everything. When his body was found murdered in the back of his car, it sent shockwaves through his community. What seemed like a disappearance quickly unraveled into a cold-blooded execution, one fueled by jealousy, betrayal, and revenge. For over a decade, the case remained unsolved. The key to unlocking the truth was a woman who had been there all along. When she finally broke her silence, it led to shocking revelations about who had set the crime in motion. This is the story of a man who preached righteousness but fell into temptation. A husband whose rage drove him to orchestrate a brutal murder and a crime that took years to unravel. In the end, the question remains, did justice truly prevail? Ann Arbor, Michigan, was supposed to be a safe place, a city filled with the promise of new beginnings. Students walking the tree-lined streets of the University of Michigan, professors buried in research, and families building their lives in quiet neighborhoods. It was a place where young women should have felt secure. But in 1980, a shadow lurked in the early morning hours. A killer moved through the streets, watching, waiting, and then he struck. Rebecca Greer Huff was 30 years old and a dedicated graduate student at the University of Michigan. She had spent years chasing knowledge, driven by a passion for literature. Her friends knew her as someone who could lose herself in books for hours, but she wasn't just a scholar. She was a sister, a daughter, and a friend. Her family described her as warm and thoughtful, always eager to help and always striving for more. They had watched her grow from a curious child into a strong, independent woman who was building a life for herself. They had no idea it would all be taken away in one night. On a quiet Sunday morning, Rebecca's body was found on the sidewalk, just blocks from campus. The scene was horrific. She had been stabbed more than 50 times. Her killer hadn't used a knife. He had used a screwdriver. A brutal, frenzied attack. The police knew immediately that this wasn't a robbery or a random assault. This was something much darker. Detective Paul Bunton had seen his share of violence, but this was different. The sheer rage in the attack, the specific targeting of a lone woman, was familiar, too familiar, because this wasn't the first time it had happened. Just months earlier, another young woman had been found dead under eerily similar circumstances. Shirley Small was only 17 years old, a high school student with dreams of her own. She had been walking home after spending the evening with friends, her mind likely on college applications, weekend plans, and the little worries of teenage life. She never made it home. Her body was found on the side of the road, her face and neck slashed. The city was shaken, but police had no suspects. And then it happened again. Glenda Richmond, 26 years old, was murdered in the same way. She had been walking home alone, just like Shirley. The wounds, the location, the method, it was clear. Ann Arbor had a serial killer, but no one knew who he was. Fear spread through the community. Women stopped walking alone at night. Parents warned their daughters to stay indoors. The university urged students to travel in groups. But none of it stopped him. Detective Buntin and his team worked around the clock, combing through crime scene evidence, talking to witnesses, and trying to find any connection between the victims. But the killer was careful. He left no fingerprints, no DNA, no obvious pattern beyond his choice of victim and time of attack. The city was on edge and the police had nothing. Then a break in the case. Officer Don Perry was out on patrol when he spotted something unusual young woman walking alone at 4:30 in the morning. But what caught his attention wasn't just her, it was the car that was following her. A man sitting behind the wheel, watching her every move. Terry called in the license plate. The name that came back sent a chill down his spine. Coral Eugene Watts. Watts was already on the police's radar. His name had come up in connection with the murders, but there had never been enough evidence to arrest him. But now, here he was, following another woman in the dead of night. It was enough for Terry to pull him over. When backup arrived, Watts was taken in for questioning. But he didn't talk. He asked for a lawyer and said nothing. Police searched his car, hoping to find the weapon, blood, or anything that could tie him to the murders. But it was clean. No hard evidence. But Watts had made a mistake. By following that woman, he had put himself directly in the sights of law enforcement, and they weren't letting him go. They placed a tracking device on his car and put him under 24-hour surveillance. They watched his every move. And then, suddenly, he was gone. Watts had left Michigan, but where he went, the violence followed. Watts resurfaced in Houston, Texas, where he quickly found new victims. On a Sunday morning, Lori Lister pulled into her apartment complex, unaware that a killer was waiting. Before she could reach her door, he attacked, grabbing her from behind and dragging her into the shadows. He strangled her, demanding to know where she lived. Upstairs, Lori's roommate, Melinda Aguilar, heard the struggle. When she opened the door, she was attacked too. Watts shoved her inside, held a knife to her throat, and told her he was going to kill her. He choked her until she lost consciousness, or so he thought. Melinda, thinking fast, pretended to pass out. Watts left her and turned his attention back to Lori, dragging her upstairs, filling the bathtub and preparing to drown her. But Melinda wasn't unconscious. She made her escape, jumping from the balcony and running for help. A neighbor called 911. When police arrived, Watts fled, leaving Lori submerged in the tub. She was pulled out just in time. As Watts ran, officers chased him down. He was caught, handcuffed, and finally in police custody. Watts was arrested and charged, but what happened next stunned everyone. In exchange for a plea deal, he confessed to 13 murders in Houston. But the deal gave him immunity for those crimes. Instead of facing the death penalty, he was sentenced only for burglary with intent to commit murder. He received 60 years in prison, but because of Texas's mandatory release laws, Watts was scheduled to be released in 2006. The families of his victims were outraged. A serial killer, a man who had confessed to more than a dozen murders, was going to walk free. But the fight wasn't over. In Michigan, prosecutors scrambled to find a way to keep him behind bars. They dug through old case files looking for anything that could be used to charge him with murder. And then they found it. A witness from 1979, Joseph Boy, had seen Watts kill a woman named Helen Dutcher. He had seen Watts raise his hand, seen the knife, seen the fatal blows. And now, 25 years later, he was willing to testify. Watts was charged with Dutcher's murder. In 2004, he stood trial. The evidence was strong. His confessions, the pattern of killings, and Foy's testimony. The jury deliberated, and when they returned, the verdict was clear: guilty. Watts was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to a maximum security facility in Michigan, where he would never hurt another woman again. For the families of his victims, there was relief, but also pain. The years had taken their toll. Mothers and fathers had buried their daughters, friends had mourned, and for decades justice had seemed out of reach. In the end, Coral Eugene Watts was a man who had evaded the law for too long, but the past had caught up with him. He died in prison in 2007, taking with him the secrets of other murders he had never confessed to. The streets of Ann Arbor, the city he once terrorized, had moved on, but the memory of his victims, the young women who never had the chance to live out their futures, remains. And for their families, justice, though delayed, was finally served. Diana Diso was just 19 years old, with her whole life ahead of her. She was a daughter, a friend, and a young woman filled with dreams. Those who knew her described her as kind-hearted, a little fiery when she needed to be, but always full of life. She had a close relationship with her mother, Mary Ann Diso, who always worried about her but trusted her independence. On the night of her disappearance, Diana was out with friends. She was in a hurry to get home, but she didn't have a ride. Hitchhiking wasn't uncommon, especially for someone who knew the area. But this time, her decision to accept a ride would cost her everything. She never made it home. Mary Ann Diso grew anxious when the night stretched on with no word from her daughter. She called around, checking with friends, but no one had seen Diana. As the hours passed, the sinking feeling in her stomach grew heavier. By the next day, it was clear something was wrong. Meanwhile, along the Hudson River, a grisly discovery was made. A body was found partially submerged in the water, pressed against a concrete shelf. She had abrasions along her back, suggesting she had been dragged or slid down the rough surface before ending up in the river. Investigators noted that her pocketbook was missing. There was nothing at the scene to identify who she was. John Murray, a homicide investigator with the New York State Police, took on the case. He had seen bodies before, but something about this one struck him. The woman had been strangled. The signs were clear: bruising around the neck and petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes. It was a brutal, personal crime. An autopsy would later confirm the worst. Not only had she been strangled, but there were also signs of sexual assault. DNA was collected, stored, and entered into a database. But at the time, there was no match. That night, as Mary Ann Diso sat watching the news, she heard a report about a body found across the Hudson River. Her heart stopped. She turned to her husband, her mind racing. "This can't be," she said. But deep down, she knew. When police reached out to families of missing women, the Disos came forward. They were shown a personal item found near the body, a hairbrush. When Mary Ann saw it, she felt the world crumble around her. "This is hers," she whispered. The case went cold. Months turned into years. Diana's family tried to find closure, but how could they? They knew someone had taken her life, but they didn't know who. The police didn't either. Years passed, then decades, but the evidence remained, and in 2004, investigators decided to take another look. Allison Eastman, a forensic analyst, ran the DNA from the crime scene through CODIS, the national database for DNA profiles. And this time there was a hit. The match was a convicted offender named Ray Kellar. Detectives were stunned. Kellar had no apparent ties to Diana. He wasn't a friend, wasn't a relative, but his criminal history painted a disturbing picture: sexual assaults, rapes, and a pattern of violence. Kellar was serving time for a 1989 rape case, just 2 years after Diana's murder. He had been sentenced to up to 25 years in prison. Investigators decided to dig deeper. They found one of Kellar's previous victims and asked her to recount her experience. She was hesitant, afraid, even after all these years. And then she said something chilling. "He tried to kill me." Like Diana, this victim had been choked. Unlike Diana, she had survived, and now, all these years later, she was the key to proving Kellar's violent tendencies. Detectives Dave Madden and Steve Ortiz knew they had to confront Kellar, but how do you get a seasoned criminal to confess? They brought in Dr. Richard Hamill, a psychologist who specialized in dealing with sexual predators. Hamill suggested a strategy to allow Kellar to explain himself, to cast himself in a better light, make him feel misunderstood. On December 17, 2004, investigators sat face-to-face with Ray Kellar inside the prison. At first, he denied everything. He claimed not to know Diana Diso. Then detectives placed a picture in front of him. "Do you know her?" Kellar stared at the image. His face remained blank. "No," he said. But the evidence said otherwise. That's when detectives played their trump card. "We have your DNA," they told him. "You were there with her. You did this." Kellar sat in silence. Minutes passed. Then he leaned back, looked at the ceiling, and said, "Hypothetically, if I were to tell you what happened, how do I know you wouldn't twist my words?" Detectives knew they had him. Slowly, Kellar began to talk. "I was high," he admitted. "Coke, dope. I was wild." He described driving around that night when he saw Diana hitchhiking. He pulled over. She got in. I asked her where she was going. She said home. But they didn't go home. Instead, Kellar drove to a secluded spot by the river. "I guess you could say she was in an angry mood," he recalled. The conversation turned. Kellar wanted sex, but Diana didn't. He forced himself on her, and when it was over, she got dressed. Then she said something that pushed him over the edge. Something snapped inside him. "I had her by the throat," he admitted, "and I was just squeezing. Just squeezing." He didn't stop, not until Diana's body went limp. He dragged her to the river, believing she was already dead. But if she wasn't, the water would take care of that. 17 years after her murder, Diana Diso's killer had finally confessed. On February 22, 2005, Kellar was officially charged with Diana's rape and murder. The trial was swift. With DNA evidence and a confession, there was little room for doubt. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to 22 years to life in prison, on top of his existing sentence. This meant that even if he finished his time in the 1989 rape case, he would remain behind bars for Diana's murder. For Marianne Diso, it was a bitter kind of justice. Nothing would bring her daughter back. But at least now they knew the truth. At least now the man who took Diana's life would never walk free again. As for Ray Kellar, he offered one final statement before being led away. "I'm truly sorry for what I've done. I have nobody to blame but myself." For Diana's family, those words meant nothing. They had spent nearly 2 decades waiting for answers, and now they finally had them. Justice had been served, but the pain would never fade. Diana Diso's story is a tragic reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never forgotten. Thanks to relentless investigators, forensic advancements, and a family that never gave up, her killer was finally held accountable. But there are still countless cold cases waiting for answers. Families still searching for closure. If you have any information on an unsolved case, even the smallest detail could make a difference. Visit your local law enforcement website, support organizations that help victims' families, and advocate for funding in forensic science, because every victim deserves justice and every family deserves the truth.